We'll get into Frank Hester in a moment, but let's get into those Red Wall MPs. Let's go now to Delta Poll Chairman Joe Twyman, who joins us. Joe, just talk to us a little bit about what that defection by Anderson yesterday to reform means. Obviously, we've heard Tice in the past kind of drop hints and things and be a bit of an agitator. But do you think that they could really win over some more Conservative politicians?
I think potentially they could. I think there will be some people who currently represent Red Wall constituencies who are looking at the polling nationally and thinking about how that will translate in their own seat and thinking, really, there's no way they'll be able to hold on to their seat as a Conservative, and so maybe they might stand a better chance as a Reform candidate. The reality, of course, as have been discovered with defectors to UKIP, is that that is rarely the case. And if you're doomed as a Conservative candidate, you're probably going to struggle as a Reform candidate as well. And so it may indeed be about sending a message about the type of Conservative party you want to be representing. But in all cases, it represents bad news for Rishi Sunak and only helps to provide further momentum for Reform, who have in many ways been the big winners over the last few months in terms of polling.
Now, Joe, in an absolute double whammy for the Conservative Party on Monday, with that happening, then this exclusive report dropping about this mega Tory donor, Hester, and his alleged racist comments, which the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, this evening has confirmed as racist. And of course, most people would agree with that. What kind of impact is that going to have on support for the Conservative Party?
I think, as you say, the key there is what most people will think. The man in question says it's not about race or about gender, but if you're describing things in the terms that he did, it's very obvious to most people that this is clearly racist and could, for some people, even be interpreted as an incitement to violence. That does not play well with many people out there. And while there, I'm sure, may be a few people who think that what he said was perhaps just a throwaway comment and should not be taken seriously, they will be very, very much in a minority. And instead, many, many people, the vast majority of people, are likely to view such terms as offensive, as not appropriate for British politics, and as painting the Conservative Party generally in a bad light.
Does the Labour Party, as the main opposition to the Conservatives and polling way ahead, stand to gain from that change in perception then?
I think it's unlikely to make an enormous difference, and simply because the Conservatives are doing so badly consistently in the polls anyway. And so for many people who are against the Conservatives at the moment, this will simply be the latest thing that upsets them. And so I don't imagine it will have a significant cause a significant change in the polls, but I do think it makes the challenge facing the Conservatives to close the gap on Labour just even more difficult.
And Joe, in terms of the timing of the election, I feel like we talk about this every time you come on because nobody knows when it is yet. And the assumption is it will be autumn, but occasionally we hear it could be May, or we're hearing there are meetings this afternoon with what's called the 1922 committee. Does that give you the sense that we might see an election earlier?
No, it really doesn't. I mean, if the last 10 years of British politics have taught us anything, it's you can't rule anything out. But I think the chances of a May election are vanishingly small. I just don't think the Conservatives are in a position to deliver. I think there are still lots of operational things that need to be sorted out on their end. But more importantly, they're 20 points behind in the polls. And that lead that Labour has been consistent. And it's really not the case that in this country that governments call elections when they are that far behind in the polls unless they have to. They don't have to at the moment, and so I imagine that the decision will come down to, do they think things will get any worse? And yes, it could possibly get worse, but there's also the chance that things could get better. And so I imagine they will get to May, they'll be behind in the polls, and they'll think, well, let's wait until autumn and see what happens. November 21st is still my guess. I don't think it's guaranteed, but I do think an autumn election is the most likely outcome. But I also don't think you can rule out a January contest either. And won't we all be thinking, oh good, an election campaign over Christmas?
Oh yes, I can't think of anything I want more for Christmas. Delta Poll Chairman Joe Twyman, thanks as ever for joining us. Well, let's see what our panel make of all of this. There's a lot of politics to chew over today. Glad to be joined in the studio by UK editor at Politico, Jack Blanchard, and Telegraph columnist Poppy Coburn. Thank you both. And Jack, I think some analysis I heard today, which I sort of agree with, is in terms of when the election will be, the Conservatives know it's a done deal. That's what some are saying. So they're just going to try and hold on for power as long as possible. Would you agree with that?
It's a little bit of that. I mean, if you're the Prime Minister, and Rishi Sunak, of course, hasn't been Prime Minister for that long, you kind of want to clock the months up, don't you? He's probably not going to get another go at this job. So even if he does think he's probably going to lose, why would you not hold on for as long as possible? And the other thing, of course, is that something might turn up. You never know. World events may change. Domestic political events may change. Flash of lightning, who knows? You know, things can happen, and we've seen that over recent years. And so, you know, for as long as Rishi Sunak can hold out, I would think he will do. I'm not sure I agree with January. That feels like a step too far, even for this Prime Minister. Nobody wants to be out door knocking over Christmas. No one wants to have people coming around on Christmas Day trying to give them leaflets and tell them to get out to the polling booth in the dark days of January. So I would think November is the most likely bet.
Poppy, would you agree with that?
No, I completely agree. I mean, first of all, the idea of someone coming down a chimney and trying to hand you a party leaflet is pretty petrifying. Well, quite. I mean, I think you're completely right. He's looking for a bolt from the blue here. He's kind of assuming. I mean, this is the desperation at the moment with the Conservative Party. It's something really quite distasteful to have to see. This idea now that no policy that they can really throw at the wall has been sticking, and we've seen this with the very disappointing reaction from the budget. You know, this was supposed to be Rishi Sunak's last major chance to make a pitch to voters and say that, you know, we are the party of tax cuts, although we're not really the party of tax cuts, and we're the party of fiscal responsibility, but maybe we're not. And I think for him, this idea that if he carries on in politics for longer and if the election is put off, that will help him. Well, I think the opposite is probably true. And I think that's why backbenchers maybe even might be pushing him, you know, to say, let's just get this over and done with. Because if we're going to keep slumping in the polls, this is going to go from a very devastating loss to a complete electoral wipeout.
Yeah, that type of pressure he might be getting from backbenchers, but also a meeting with the 1922 committee we know is generally forbears bad things, but hopefully not today. In terms of we're on air already, we can't handle any more breaking news. And just before we came on air, we did get the response from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, that he does consider Frank Hester, this Tory donor's comments, racist, unacceptable. And he said Hester has shown remorse, and this sort of language of we'd welcome an apology, which Kemi Badenoch also said earlier in the day. I mean, why do you think it took all day to get to this point, Jack?
I can think of 10 million reasons why it's taken all day to get this point. The Tory party have obviously been scrabbling around wondering what the heck to do about this story. We saw ministers getting sent out this morning very carefully not saying that they thought it was racist. We heard that time and time again. Then over the day, the pressure built. Kemi Badenoch just came out and said, yeah, of course it is. And I guess in the end, the Prime Minister felt slightly bounced into it. Of course, this is Tuesday evening, we're talking. Wednesday will be Prime Minister's questions. Had he not come out and said this tonight, you can imagine the scene with Keir Starmer over the dispatch box demanding he say it and probably getting it out of him that way. And that is not a good look for a Prime Minister on live TV. And so he probably decided in the end, best just to come and say it now.
Yeah, you're right. Prime Minister's questions tomorrow. This is highly likely to come up. And it did take for Kemi Badenoch, it felt like. Do you think she went out on her own agenda there, Poppy, to say it? Let's remember, she's a black woman. The comments were about black women. She has been, there has been sort of analysis in the past that she might be angling for a leadership position at some point. But do you think she tipped Sunak's hand in this?
Well, I certainly think that she had a better idea of how to handle this, you know, pretty horrendous scandal than the Prime Minister has. Although I will say with her comments, if she put out, you know, a statement about this, she obviously condemned them as being, you know, racialised comments, said that they were unacceptable. But she also, in the second part of her statement, does mention the idea that certainly people say things in private they don't always necessarily mean. So there was a little bit of something at the end there which was still holding back. And I will note that she didn't come out and say, we as a party, you know, must condemn this entirely and give that £5 million back and the proposed extra £5 million that he was supposed to be donating. But again, it's just, you know, when the Conservative Party kind of waits and does this half-measure strategy, they just end up hurting themselves so much more because it looks insincere. Rather than coming out straight away and saying, this is unacceptable, we must cut ties immediately, this is obviously racist comment, this is obviously sexist, at a time we've been talking about MP safety, safety, you can almost see the gears turning in their head and going, is this going to be used against us by the Labour Party? And that, I think, is a real failure of leadership.
The other thing as well, Rosanna, is, Joe was saying there, is this going to affect them in the polls? Probably not very much. I think I agree with that. But the problem with all of these things, and we've had scandal after scandal or error after error or whatever that you want to call them, there seems to be something new every week or every day or several things a day. But what it is an opportunity cost. The Tory parties desperately need to start making the running again. They're 20-odd points behind in the polls. They have to be grasping the narrative, slamming Labour for whatever they want to slam Labour for, getting their policies out there. And instead, they're constantly on the back foot. It was Lee Anderson yesterday. Now it's this today. Nobody's thinking about positive Tory party policies. It's just one thing after another. And it just means the chances of them somehow staging a comeback just reduce and reduce and reduce.
Yeah, and you bring that up. I was going to mention that this week was supposed to be what journalists are calling extremism week. The politics, the Conservative Party were coming out on the front foot to say they're going to tackle what the definition of extremism is. We had that speech from Rishi Sunak on a Friday night a few weeks ago. He was talking about uniting the country and religious division in this country and everything else. And then it's been absolutely sidelined by these comments from this Tory donor that have been unearthed, these racist comments. So we've now got the racism scandal. In prior weeks, we've had the anti-Semitism scandal, the Islamophobia scandal, not all about the Conservative Party, but about the two main parties in this country. And it is just this churn for voters to try to understand what is going on. Where do you think, Poppy, that leaves reform in terms of having some sort of clarity for voters?
Well, I think, Reform are essentially a protest party, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, because of the electoral system we have in this country, it's not going to be a situation where Reform are putting forward a Prime Minister. But I think it's extremely worrying that worrying, I don't really think it's worrying. I think it's understandable on the part of myself personally, but on behalf of the Tory party, it's going to be very worrying for them to see that on their right flank, they are just hemorrhaging voters at the moment. And this is something that Rishi Sunak has really struggled from the very beginning of his premiership to shape this image that he has, that he's, kind of a centrist, slightly wet. He's been coming out with these slight culture war statements, but they come across as quite false and flat. And again, Reform are going to benefit every time the Conservatives have these embarrassing PR mishaps. And this one, particularly today, is just utterly disastrous.
Jack, do you believe Richard Tice, leader of Reform, in the hints he's dropping that he's meeting with other Conservative MPs?
I mean, I'm sure he is meeting with other Conservative MPs. I would take everything he says with a colossal pinch of salt, though. I mean, I just think we don't know yet whether other MPs will defect. They might do if this situation continues, but they have to believe if they're going to do that, they've got a better chance of re-election with Reform. And as Poppy just said, Reform are causing the Tories a problem, but they're not actually in a position where we're expecting them to start picking up lots of seats. So the chances of a Tory MP gaining by defecting to them still looks rather slim at this stage. And I do think as well, what we often see as elections, come closer, and this one is still, we think, several months away, is that these smaller parties get very squeezed, because what you'll hear from the Tories as we get close to polling day, again and again and again, is if you vote for Reform, you're going to let Keir Starmer into Downing Street. And the problem with that message for Reform is it's kind of true. If you don't want Keir Starmer to be Prime Minister, it probably does need to be Rishi Sunak. And therefore, that message, I think, will have some impact unless Reform can come up with some way to counteract it.
Jack, Poppy, thank you very much.